So before we conclude this presentation, I want to look at one more real-life example of group collaborative activities and collaborative information retrieval gone horribly wrong. So we're going to look at the famous Challenger explosion. This event actually happened before the explosion of Columbia. The Challenger occurred in 1986. Columbia exploded in 2003. But I chose to talk about the latter event first because it was a case where the main problem was simply a breakdown in communication and a loss of that necessary flow of information we've been talking so much about. But the Challenger was a bit different because although there certainly were problems with communication and the flow of information, there's actually an even more alarming and dangerous problem with collaboration on display with Challenger, specifically a phenomenon known as groupthink, which I'll get into in more detail in a moment. But first, I just want to explain that the Challenger explosion was really culturally significant. One of the reasons was the fact that of the 7 people on board who lost their lives, one of them was a woman by the name of Christine McAuliffe. She was a teacher from my home state of New Hampshire. I live in the Great White Mountains of New Hampshire, and she was from around this area as well. She had been chosen as the first person to teach in space. She won like a contest for it, and she was going to conduct classes on the shuttle and then have those classes transmit back home. So this whole disaster was made all the more tragic by the fact that they had a civilian on board. But just to go back to how the Challenger explosion was a prime example of a flawed communication system, there were so many instances when the catastrophe could have been avoided in the first place. For instance, there were some concerns from engineers about the faulty O-ring. The cold temperature on the morning of the takeoff was another concern, and even the possibility of seal leakage on previous flights was brought up. But all of these concerns were kept in one level of the organization. What I mean by that is if you go to our annotated bibliography, you'll see an article about the Challenger explosion. I recommend you read it. It's really, again, interesting, kind of like the Columbia article. Both are very fascinating papers. But in the Challenger paper, the author mentions that all of the 3 concerns I just mentioned, the faulty O-ring, the cold temperature, and the possibility of seal leakage, all these concerns were, quote, confined to people with level 4 clearance. And level 4 clearance means the contractor and people like that were confined to level 4 clearance and level 3 clearance, meaning some of the engineers at the Marshall and Kennedy Space Centers knew this, but these concerns were never then, quote, relayed to levels 1 and 2, meaning levels 1 and 2 are the higher ups who make the most important decisions. And basically this means that the cause of the tragedy, which was ultimately determined by the Presidential Commission to be a defective O-ring seal on the rocket, a problem, quote, exacerbated by the cold weather, unquote. Basically, it just means that it could have all been easily prevented if the information had been correctly and effectively transmitted to the higher-ups and the decision makers. So again, very similar. It's almost like Columbia was a repeat of this. But well, however, a weak flow of information was not really the biggest contributor to Challenger destruction like it was for Columbia. That's the biggest difference because instead of having a weak flow of information, the fault lies more with the information culture of NASA, which developed a groupthink mindset. So let's kind of talk about what groupthink is before we go further. The technical definition of groupthink, which you can find in the article mentioned in our annotated bibliography. It's written by James Esser and Joanne Linderfer. They define groupthink as, quote, a psychological phenomenon that occurs within a group of people in which the desire for harmony or conformity in the group results in an irrational or dysfunctional decision-making outcome, unquote. As you can see from the slide, I decided to summarize groupthink as, quote, when group collaboration becomes group dereliction. I think this is kind of a nice little way to put it. I made it up because it's not as if information is not being shared and communicated in instances of groupthink, but rather the problem is more that certain information is being stifled, which is just as dangerous and concerning, especially when it comes to something as serious and life-threatening as a space shuttle launch. For Challenger, this came into play when the launch was delayed a few times. The shuttle was supposed to launch on 3 different occasions, and each time some problem would come up, either the weather or they were concerned about something. So the press and the general public started to get a little bit antsy. They were calling NASA out and saying that the whole process was taking too long and they were stalling. So the higher ups in the organization, who were more concerned with their reputations and looking good to the public and sticking to the planned schedule than with the safety of the shuttle's passengers, those higher ups decided to discount information about the dangers of launching that particular morning due to the weather. And the groupthink mindset of the entire organization meant that no one really dared to step in and call out the safety and ethical implications of what was about to go down. I just mentioned a slide earlier that the first sentence in my article states that it is, quote, essential for professional workers to stay both informed and inform their work environments in order to effectively manage knowledge and stay competitive, efficient, and innovative. And I like to place emphasis on the last part of that statement, especially the part about staying innovative, because this is precisely what groupthink erodes, because in a groupthink environment, individual members of the group are strongly discouraged from accepting any disagreement with the general consensus. And so they kind of feel compelled to set aside their own thoughts and feelings and just blindly follow the word of other group members. So people will kind of refrain from expressing any doubts they have, and this basically just means that risk taking becomes all too common and a lack of creative feeling and innovation becomes the norm. So, in other words, organizations want that knowledge culture that the first article, the dynamic knowledge one, talked about before. Whereas a groupthink culture is exactly the opposite of a knowledge culture, and NASA, or perhaps most importantly, the 7 people on board the Challenger, paid the ultimate price for this work environment infested by groupthink. I think this real life example is a true testament to just how essential it is for an organization, any organization, let alone one as important as NASA, to carefully and methodically put healthy and sound communication structures in place so that information sharing, learning, seeking, and retrieving is easily and frequently done among all members of the organization. Okay, so if you're interested in learning more about the Challenger explosion and how groupthink played a role in it, I highly encourage you to watch the video right below this one. It's a fairly short clip. I think it's only over only a little over 3 minutes long, but it does a nice job summarizing all the key points of the issue. And of course, I'd also encourage you again to glance over the article mentioned in the bibliography about the Challenger. It's definitely a fascinating read. Thank you.